Mail-order bride was sent back for being too curvy, but the quiet rancher saw her real worth.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Dry Hollow, Colorado Territory. Early winter, 1882. The stagecoach came in late. Its wheels rattled hard across the frozen ground, mud stiff with morning frost. Dust clung low to the earth as the town stirred in quiet disinterest. Most of Dry Hollow had seen the coach before. It came twice a week, rain or snow, and rarely carried anything interesting. But today it stopped longer than usual. When the door creaked open, Rosa Lindley stepped down onto the dirt street in buttoned boots that hadn't been made for walking. Her cheeks were red from windburn, lips dry. Her dress, a dark blue Eastern traveling gown with a corseted waist and delicate trim, looked fine from a distance, but up close, it told a different story. The bodice was too tight across her full chest, the side seams tugged near her hips, and the neckline had torn slightly from too many hours jostling inside the coach. One sleeve had frayed near the elbow. She pulled her coat tighter around her and stood still, glancing around with forced calm. She spotted him, Emery Baird, clean, pale, well-dressed in a town that mostly ran on sweat and cattle. He approached her with a nervous glance toward the handful of onlookers gathered at the depot, stable hands, shopkeepers, and one nosy old widow pretending to sweep her stoop. "You, Miss Lindley?" Emery asked stiffly. "Yes," she said, voice quiet but even. "You sent for me." He looked her up and down, not kindly. His gaze paused at her chest, then moved to the tear in her sleeve. He shifted uncomfortably. I don't think this is going to work." "You're not." He trailed off. Rosa stared at him, expression neutral. He forced a breath and glanced toward his father, who stood nearby with arms crossed. "I was expecting someone more modest, more refined in figure," Emery said at last. There it was. Rosa didn't blink. She just nodded once, slowly. "I came halfway across the country for this." Emery gave a tight, embarrassed shrug. "I'm sorry. The arrangement's off." His father turned without a word and started back toward the bank. Emery followed him like a dog with its tail tucked, never looking back. Rosa stood there in silence. Then, with measured steps, she walked to the edge of the wooden platform and sat down. She lowered her carpet bag to the ground beside her boots and folded her hands over her lap. Her fingers shook. She didn't let them show. She lifted her chin and stared straight ahead at nothing in particular. Her chest ached, but not from the cold. She could feel them watching, whispering. The widow on the stoop leaned a little further over her broom. Rosa didn't cry. Not here, not in front of these people. She had risked everything, left Philadelphia with one letter in her pocket and a promise of a husband at the other end. Her father was gone. Her mother remarried a man who called her too proud to keep. There'd been nowhere else to go, and now there still wasn't. Across the street, Gabe Harland had just finished tying down feed sacks in the back of his wagon. He wore a heavy canvas duster and a worn hat pulled low against the sun, beard thick against the wind. A limp made his steps uneven, but steady. He didn't move fast, but he never needed to. Gabe hadn't planned to come to town today, but the south fence had blown down in the last storm, and the cattle needed feed before the snow deepened. He didn't like people. He didn't like town. He especially didn't like being reminded of the years he'd spent losing things. First his leg to a Confederate minie-ball, then his brother to fever, then his wife to childbirth out on that same lonely ranch where he still lived. For the last 5 years, Gabe had worked the land alone. That was enough, or it had been. He noticed her the moment she stepped down from the coach. Not because she was crying, she wasn't. And not just because she was beautiful, but because she looked like someone trying not to fall apart in front of people who wanted her to, and failing just a little. Her dress was fine-made, but her body had strained against it through too many miles. She sat there now with her hands folded too neatly, her carpet bag clutched beside her like it held her only hope. And maybe it did. He knew the look. People talked like shame was loud, but real shame was quiet. It looked like her. He watched for a moment longer, then walked across the street. Rosa heard his boots before she looked up. He stopped in front of her without a word. She raised her eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dust-streaked. He didn't look at her the way the banker's son had. His eyes were pale gray-blue and steady. He didn't glance down her bodice, didn't smile, didn't ask questions, just stood there like a man used to making decisions and never needing to explain them. Finally, Gabe nodded toward his wagon. Rosa blinked. What? He pointed again. Wagon's mine. She looked from him to the empty road, then to the depot office, then back to him. Where would you be taking me? She asked cautiously. West, he said. One word. Firm. She could feel the stares from the depot window, the widow still sweeping, a boy peering from behind the general store's crates. She could say no. She should probably say no, but he didn't look like a man who meant harm. He looked tired, like someone who didn't want company but was offering it anyway. And she had no money, no ticket back east, no food, an address that wouldn't last another night in the cold. She stood. All right, she said. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask for it. Rosa climbed into the wagon. It was rough, boards creaking under her weight, and she sat upright with the carpet bag in her lap. Gabe climbed up beside her, picked up the reins, and gave the mules a quiet click. They pulled away from town slowly. Neither of them spoke as dry hollow shrank behind them. Just buildings in the dust, now smaller with every mile. The wind cut through her coat. Gabe noticed and pulled off his own duster, thick and lined with old wool, and handed it over. Rosa looked at him, surprised but didn't argue. She pulled it around her shoulders and tried not to shiver. It smelled like pine smoke and worn leather. She didn't know where she was going. He hadn't asked who she was. They didn't exchange names, but she didn't feel afraid. And that, after the week she'd had, was enough. The wagon creaked onward toward the edge of the pines, where the land got quiet and the world stopped caring what people looked like. The sun had already dropped behind the ridge by the time Gabe turned the wagon off the main trail and onto a thinner track that wound through frozen brush and narrow pine stands. The wind had shifted colder, coming down from the mountains sharp and dry, cutting through Rosa's borrowed coat. She pulled it tighter around her, the collar brushing her cheek. Her carpet bag sat between her feet. Her hands were stiff from cold, but she hadn't spoken since they left town. She didn't know how long the ride had been, an hour, maybe more, but the silence hadn't felt threatening, just unspoken. She glanced at him once or twice, noticing how his eyes stayed on the trail, how he shifted his weight slightly every time the wagon bumped, favoring one side. He rode like a man who was used to pain but didn't talk about it. She hadn't asked his name, and he hadn't asked hers. They finally crested a low rise, and there it was, the cabin. It sat at the edge of a clearing, flanked by a small barn and a stack of split wood covered in canvas. The roof had patches but looked solid. Smoke drifted from the chimney. He must have banked the fire before leaving that morning. There were no animals in sight, but fencing curved around the property in wide loops, and faint prints in the frost told of hooves and boots. Gabe pulled the wagon to a stop beside the porch and set the brake. He climbed down with a grunt, limping slightly as he rounded to her side and offered a hand. She took it hesitantly, but was surprised by the steadiness of his grip. Inside, the air was warm, not cozy, but warm enough that the ache in her fingers began to fade. A stove stood at the far wall, glowing faintly. A battered table with 2 chairs sat near a shelf of jars and dried goods. Everything was simple. No decoration, no personal touches. A cot in one corner had a wool blanket folded sharp at the edge. A rifle leaned by the door. He set down a crate he'd carried from the wagon and unwrapped his scarf. Then he moved to the stove, stoking the fire with practiced efficiency. Rosa stayed by the door, unsure. "You can hang that coat there," he said, pointing to a peg on the wall. His voice was deep but low, almost like it hadn't been used much recently. She nodded, slipped the coat off slowly, and hung it. Her dress beneath was still dusty and torn. One shoulder had slipped again, exposing more skin than she liked, and she tugged it back in place. He didn't look. He didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask why she'd come. But something in the way he moved, quiet, unrushed, told her he already understood more than he let on. "I'll fix something," he said, already reaching for a pot and some dried beans. "I can help," she said quietly. He glanced at her, then nodded once. They worked side by side. He didn't give orders, just moved aside when she reached for something, handed her a knife when she went for the sack of potatoes, and didn't flinch when she cut the skin of her thumb. She didn't complain. He passed her a rag without comment. Later, they ate with spoons scraped from tin. The stew wasn't seasoned much, but it was hot, and her stomach tightened with relief. She hadn't eaten since morning, maybe earlier. She kept her eyes on the bowl, careful not to slurp, her back straight. Even now, she didn't want to seem like someone in need. He finished first, wiped his spoon with a cloth, and stood. "You can have the cot," he said simply. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll take the chair." "No," she said too quickly, then softened. "I'll sleep near the stove." He looked at her for a long second, then nodded again. While he stepped outside to check the barn, Rosa peeled off the worst of her dress and laid it over a chair to dry. Underneath, she wore a corset and shift, both wrinkled and worn, but clean enough. She pulled the borrowed coat back around herself and sat cross-legged on the rug near the stove, her carpet bag tucked close. She undid the pins in her hair, letting it fall in thick waves over her shoulders. Gabe returned without comment. He didn't stare. He just kicked off his boots and lowered himself into the chair with a soft grunt. His leg was stiff, she could tell. Probably always would be. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, wind brushed against the walls like dry breath. She watched him. His eyes were half closed, his jaw set with a kind of still pain that didn't need explaining. She recognized it because it was the same one she'd worn for weeks. Silent, worn through, but not done. "You live out here alone?" she asked finally. He opened his eyes. "Yeah." "Why'd you come to town?" "Needed feed." A pause. She almost asked why he'd brought her here, but she already knew. Not the full answer, but enough. "You don't know me," she said. He shrugged. "You needed somewhere." Another silence. "Rosa," she said after a minute. "My name." Gabe nodded slowly. "Gabe." And that was it. The fire burned lower. She laid down, wrapped in the coat, her body sore from travel, head resting on her arm. He stayed seated in the chair, one hand hanging over the side, eyes on the floor. Rosa didn't sleep easy. Her heart still raced too often. Her jaw clenched when the wind howled just right outside the cabin. But she wasn't cold, and she wasn't alone. In the quiet, beneath the smell of wood smoke and stew, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something like the beginning of it. The next morning came cold and colorless, sky the same shade as the frost-crusted ground. Wind had pushed snow across the lower field overnight. It wasn't deep, but enough to hush every step and bite through the seams of clothes not made for mountain winters. Rosa woke to the smell of coffee, real, brewed thick and black, and the sound of boots on plank flooring. Gabe moved around the cabin without much noise, but she could tell he'd been up for hours. She sat up slowly, wrapping the coat tighter around herself. Her muscles ached. The fire had gone low sometime in the night, but the cabin held enough heat to keep her from freezing. Gabe glanced over once as she stirred, then went back to setting a dented mug on the table beside a chipped bowl of oats. He didn't say good morning. She didn't expect him to, but he nodded toward the food, which was enough. She sat stiffly at the table, murmured a thank you, and ate. He stood by the window with his coffee, looking out across the white-rimmed fence line. "I've got chores to do," he said after a while, setting down his cup. "If you want to keep warm, stay close to the fire. I'll be back by sundown." She finished chewing. "I can help." He turned, brow low. "Don't need you to—" She met his gaze evenly. "I didn't ask if you did." Another pause. He studied her. Her hair was still half loose from the night before. She'd cinched the coat around her again, sleeves too long for her arms. Her eyes were tired, but her voice was steady. "I'll find something for you to wear," he said, and walked out the door. A minute later, he came back in with a bundle. Canvas trousers, an old flannel shirt, boots, and a patched wool hat. Everything smelled faintly of hay and horses. She looked at it in her lap for a moment, then took them behind the partition to change. The trousers were too long and had to be rolled. The shirt hung loose, but wide enough to move in. She tied her hair back, tugged on the boots, and stepped outside. Snow crunched underfoot. Wind cut down the slope from the ridge, sharp and constant. Gabe stood by the barn, already hauling hay out to the cattle pen. He didn't look surprised to see her. He handed her a fork. "Start with the stalls." She nodded. It went like that for hours. Gabe didn't offer praise, and Rosa didn't expect it. She kept pace slow but steady. Her hands blistered quickly, soft skin not used to pitchforks, but she kept working. When he lifted feed sacks, she held the gate. When he fixed a hinge on the barn door, she passed him nails. The silence between them stayed, but not like before. This silence worked. It moved. At midday, they sat outside the barn, each eating bread and jerky from the same cloth pouch. She didn't ask how long he'd lived alone. He didn't ask what had driven her west. But there were questions in the air between them. She wondered how badly his legs still hurt. It showed in the way he walked and how long he stood before shifting weight. She wondered how long it had been since he'd spoken more than a few words in a day. She wondered what had made him offer her a place here. Gabe, for his part, watched her hands, not her figure this time. Though he'd noticed it again that morning, the way her hips filled out the two big pants, the way her breasts shifted beneath the shirt when she bent to lift a bucket. He noticed, but he didn't let himself linger. He watched how she worked. No complaint, no playing helpless. When she winced from her blistered palms, she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. "You done this before?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, but I've seen it done, and I learned fast." He nodded. Later, back inside, she peeled off the coat and hung it beside the fire. Her cheeks were raw from wind. Her lips cracked. She wrapped her hands with salve she'd found in a jar by the stove. She didn't ask whose it had been. He didn't say. "You should wear gloves tomorrow," he said quietly. She nodded. "I didn't know if you'd want me back outside." Gabe looked at her then. "Don't see why not. You work." She didn't smile. Not really. But she didn't look away. That night, she moved her bedding a little closer to the stove. Not much. Just enough. He sat across the room, in the chair again, reading a torn dime novel she'd noticed tucked behind the flour sack. He didn't offer conversation. But when the wind howled and she flinched, an old reaction she couldn't break, he set the book down, stood, and added another log to the fire. Then he looked at her and asked, "You warm enough?" She nodded. "Yes. Thank you." He paused. "You could tell me if you're not." That was the first full sentence he'd offered her. She said nothing, just pulled the blanket tighter and watched the flames climb. Outside, the snow began again. Soft, slow, steady. No sound but the creak of the roof and the low crack of burning wood. Inside the cabin, a routine had begun. They didn't call it anything, but it was starting to feel like something. The third morning started with wind that hadn't stopped all night, rattling the shutters and pushing smoke sideways from the chimney. The snow had crusted over, hard enough that boots didn't sink, just crack through the surface. Gabe was already outside when Rosa opened the door, dressed again in the loose flannel and the patched canvas pants he'd given her. Her hands were bandaged now. She wore gloves he'd left folded on the table without a word. She stepped out, cinching the coat around her waist. Gabe was by the corral, hammering a post back into place. He didn't turn when she came near. "Fence line blew down on the east ridge," he said. She nodded and followed him to the sled, where he loaded tools and rope. They rode side by side in silence again, bumping over frozen ground. The sky was overcast, heavy with more snow. Rosa watched the trees pass, her gloved hands folded in her lap. She hadn't asked how long he'd been alone, but now she wondered if there had ever been anyone here before her. The second cot in the corner of the cabin, folded and unused. The worn spot on the porch rail, like someone had stood there every morning for years. They reached the ridge around midday. The fence had sagged under the weight of snow. Gabe stepped down first, limping harder now. The cold always made it worse, she could tell. "I can carry that," Rosa offered, pointing to the beam. He hesitated, then handed it to her. "Lift straight. Don't twist." She nodded. They worked for hours. Gabe dug out the old post holes, steady and focused. Rosa hauled wood tied wire. She didn't complain once. At some point, Gabe looked over and realized he hadn't needed to slow down for her all day. When the last post was in place, they sat on a rock under a stand of bare aspen trees, drinking water from shared canteen. The wind had died for the first time all day. Their breath showed in thin trails. "You were married before," Rosa said suddenly. Gabe didn't answer at first. Then, "Yeah. She died here." He nodded. "Years ago." "What happened?" He didn't look at her. "Childbirth." Rosa held the canteen a little tighter. "I'm sorry. She wanted the land. Said she didn't mind the quiet. Thought it'd be different, I guess." They sat in silence. "I don't mind the quiet," Rosa said finally. "I just wasn't ready for it to be permanent." He looked at her then. "Wasn't your fault." She shrugged. "Doesn't change the fact that I'm still here," and he wanted no part of me. Gabe's eyes held to hers longer this time. His loss. The words were simple, but they sat heavy between them. Back at the cabin, Rosa moved slower, her body stiff from the long work. She peeled the gloves off inside and winced at her raw palms. Gabe, who had just set his coat down, crossed the room, opened a drawer, and handed her a small tin of salve. She took it gently. As she dabbed the ointment onto her hands, he lit the stove again. The fire caught quick, crackling in the grate. "You've got steady hands," he said. She gave a small, surprised laugh. "They don't feel steady." "They are." She looked up. His face was calm, unreadable, but his voice had changed. Quieter. "I used to do embroidery," she said. "For church women, back east." He nodded slowly. "You're used to fine things." "I was used to pretending I was," she said. "There's a difference." She stood and moved toward the hearth, kneeling to stir the fire. As she leaned forward, the old shirt she wore shifted, her neckline falling wide on one side, exposing the top of her shoulder and part of her chest. She realized it too late. Straightened quickly. Gabe had seen. He turned away, jaw tightening. She didn't speak. He didn't either. But something between them shifted, tense, real, and unspoken. Later that night, as snow began to fall again outside, she stood at the stove, stirring stew while he repaired a boot at the table. His hands were thick, weathered, but careful. Her hair had come mostly undone, loose strands clinging to her cheek in the firelight. "Why'd you help me?" she asked quietly, not turning from the pot. Gabe didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Didn't seem right, leaving you there." "That's simple." He met her eyes. "Yeah." She didn't ask anything more. That night, she laid her bedding down closer to the fire. Gabe didn't stop her. She didn't try to explain the slight shake in her hands, or the way her heart still jumped at sharp noises, or the ache in her chest that had started the moment she stepped off that stage and hadn't quite left since. He didn't ask, but when she finally drifted off, he looked over once from the chair. Watch her breath slow, her face soft in sleep. He leaned forward, added one more log to the fire, then sat back. Still didn't speak, but in his mind, something had settled. She belonged here more than she knew, and he didn't mind her staying. By the end of the week, Rosa had settled into the rhythm of Gabe Harlan's ranch. Early mornings, hard labor, quiet meals, and long silences that no longer felt like walls. Her body still ached in places from work she'd never done before, but her hands had calloused over and her breath didn't hitch every time she lifted a feed bucket or pushed open the barn door. She had stopped flinching when she heard a coyote call out in the night. She didn't startle when he passed behind her. She still didn't ask questions, and Gabe still didn't offer many answers. But they shared the stove now without effort. She wore the clothes he'd given her like they'd always been hers. And every night, she laid her bedding a few inches closer to the fire, and he let it happen without comment. It was the first time in weeks she'd stopped waiting for the next bad thing. Then, before noon on a gray Tuesday, it arrived. The sound of hooves echoed off the tree line. Gabe was outside, chopping wood. Rosa was inside, wiping the table clean when the sound carried over the ridge. Too fast for cattle, too sharp for deer. She stepped onto the porch just as Gabe straightened, axe still in his grip. A single rider broke through the snow-dusted brush, coat flapping behind him, horse sweating hard despite the cold. The man wore a town deputy's star and a mouth too ready to talk. "Harlan," he called out, pulling his horse short near the edge of the clearing. "You up?" Gabe didn't answer right away. He walked over slowly, axe still in hand but lowered. "What's the business, Cooper?" Gabe asked, calm but flat. The deputy scanned the cabin, his eyes briefly catching on Rosa at the door. "That her?" Gabe didn't look back. "Who?" "The girl from the stage. Banker's son says she ran off with some stranger." claimed she owed him money for the cost of the letter, the fare. Rosa felt her heart beat faster. Not fear exactly, more like the tight tension of shame resurfacing. She didn't move, didn't go back inside. She stood there, lips pressed tight, chin high. Gabe turned toward the cabin finally and looked at her. "She owe you anything?" he asked her, his voice level. Rosa shook her head once. "No." Gabe turned back. "Then she's not running." Cooper raised his brows. "Look, I don't care what you're doing out here, Gabe, but the boy's making noise in town. If she's here, she is." Gabe cut in. Cooper stared. "You're admitting it? She's not property. She's not hiding. She's staying. And that's all I gotta say." The deputy shifted in his saddle, unsure how to respond to that kind of plainness. "All right then, I'll tell him you said so." Gabe gave one nod. "You do that." Cooper turned his horse slowly, then paused. "You always were good at keeping to yourself. But this, a lot of folks gonna talk." Gabe didn't answer. Cooper rode off. The silence afterward was long. The snow had started falling again, light and slow. Gabe didn't move for a full minute. Neither did she. Finally, he walked toward the porch, boots crunching across frost-bitten earth. Rosa stepped aside to let him in. He set the axe by the door, pulled off his gloves, and walked to the stove. Started tending the fire like nothing had happened. Rosa stood in the middle of the room, her arms crossed. "I didn't expect them to come looking for me," she said after a moment. Gabe didn't look up. "They didn't come for you. They came to make noise. You didn't have to say I was here. I don't lie." That hung between them. She walked closer, standing near the table, watching him adjust the wood. "That boy in town, Emery, he humiliated me. Said I was too much, too soft. Said he was doing me a favor sending me back." Gabe looked up now. "You believe that?" "I did." She paused, but not anymore. His eyes held on hers. "Good." She moved to the stove, took the kettle, and filled it from the barrel near the window. Set it to boil without asking. Her hand brushed his as she reached for the handle. He didn't pull away. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. "Why'd you speak for me?" Gabe didn't answer right away. He set a pot down, scraped beans into it. "I've been alone a long time," he said finally. "Sometimes too long." She didn't speak. "I don't expect anything," he added. "I just know what's decent. And leaving you alone out here with no name and no place to go, that wasn't decent." The kettle hissed softly as it heated. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped closer. She reached out, slowly, and laid her hand gently on his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me." He didn't move, but she felt something shift under his skin. That night, after the fire was built strong and the stew was done, they sat together in the quiet. Gabe didn't return to his chair across the room. He stayed at the table after supper, mending a leather strap while she cleaned the dishes. At one point, when she walked past, her hand brushed his shoulder lightly. He didn't flinch. He just let it be. The snow outside thickened. And for the first time since arriving, Rosa didn't feel like she was waiting to be sent away. She had chosen to stay. And Gabe, quiet, steady, haunted Gabe, was starting to make space for her to belong. The thaw came slowly, like the land wasn't sure it wanted to wake up. The snow didn't melt so much as recede, leaving behind thick mud, dead grass, and the first signs of green in places that had been frozen for months. The air still bit in the mornings, but by midday it softened, and the sun held a little longer in the sky. Rosa had stopped asking where she stood in Gabe's life. It didn't feel like a question anymore. She was still in his cabin, still waking to the sound of his boots on the porch, still stirring the fire before he came in. She wore his clothes without hesitation now. Loose flannel shirts with rolled sleeves, his old trousers cinched with a rope belt, sometimes just one of his work shirts hanging long over her bare legs when the mornings were warmer and the stove ran low. He'd never said anything when he saw her like that, but his eyes lingered longer now, not leering, just still, a quiet kind of hunger that he kept buried behind silence and routine. She felt it too. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, it was how close he stood when they worked together in the barn. How his hand would graze hers when passing tools. How she no longer flinched when he brushed her waist to reach a shelf behind her. He didn't pull away either. They didn't speak of it, but the air between them had changed. Slower, heavier. One afternoon, Rosa was hauling water from the creek, boots sinking into wet ground. The sun was strong enough to warm her back through her shirt. She paused near the cabin to rest and saw Gabe up on the roof, checking for damage. He moved carefully, his limp more pronounced when climbing. She watched him in silence, a soft smile tugging at her lips. He hadn't shaved in days. The beard suited him. She hadn't told him that. He looked down and caught her watching. "You all right?" he called. "Yeah," she said, shielding her eyes. "You shouldn't be up there alone." He grunted. "I ain't that fragile." She tilted her head. "Didn't say you were." He gave a slight nod, like that meant something, then looked back to the shingles. That evening, they worked side by side at the stove. She was slicing potatoes. He was seasoning meat. It was the closest they'd stood for more than a moment. When she leaned to grab the kettle, her hip pressed lightly against his. He didn't move away. Neither did she. Later, after they'd eaten, Rosa sat on the edge of her bedding, brushing her hair out with her fingers. Gabe was on the floor nearby, fixing a leather strap on one of the harnesses. The fire crackled between them. "Did you ever think of leaving here?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "Used to. Why didn't you?" "Too tired. And nothing out there I wanted." She was quiet a long moment. "And now?" He finally looked at her. His eyes didn't flicker away. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded, accepting that. But something in her settled, because he'd looked at her when he said it. The next night, she couldn't sleep. The air was too warm. The fire had burned down low. She lay on her back, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Across the room, Gabe shifted in his chair but didn't rise. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No." Another pause. "Cold." She shook her head. "Too warm." She sat up slowly. The blanket slipped down to her waist, and her shift was thin. She didn't cover herself, didn't speak. He stood, crossed to the stove, stirred the coals, then turned back to her. "I can take the chair," she said softly. "You don't have to sleep there every night." Gabe didn't move for a moment. Then he sat down beside her, careful, like unsure whether to stay. She didn't shift away. "You've been kind to me," she said. "But I'm not broken." "I never thought you were," he said. She reached for his hand. He let her. It was quiet, just the wind outside and the faint crack of burning wood. His thumb moved slowly along the back of her fingers. Her breathing shifted. She leaned into him, her shoulder against his chest. He didn't touch her back or pull her closer, but his presence surrounded her like shelter. His hand stayed over hers, warm and rough. She lifted her head, looked at him in the firelight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She leaned in slowly, pausing just before her lips reached his. He met her there, one soft kiss, brief but held. When it ended, I didn't move away. She looked at him again. "You don't have to stay alone anymore." He touched her face then, brushing a curl behind her ear. "I know," he said. That night, she didn't move her bedding, and he didn't return to the chair. Morning came slow and golden, slipping through the small window above the stove in soft beams that warmed the floorboards. Rosa opened her eyes to the smell of pine smoke and the weight of Gabe's coat still draped across her legs. For a long moment, she stayed still, listening. His breathing was quiet behind her, steady close. She didn't move, didn't want to. She wasn't used to waking up beside someone who hadn't taken something from her. But this was different. He hadn't reached for her in the dark. He hadn't tried to claim anything. He had simply stayed near, one arm slung over her waist, warm and still. She turned her head slightly and saw him awake, eyes open, watching the ceiling. "Morning," she said, voice low. "Yeah," he answered, rough from sleep. Neither of them moved. There wasn't awkwardness, just stillness. The kind that comes when something has changed, but no one has named it yet. She sat up slowly, pulling the coat tighter around herself, and walked barefoot to the stove to stoke the fire. He followed a minute later, rising without complaint, even though she could see how stiff his leg was. He poured water into the kettle. She didn't speak. Neither did he, but the silence had shifted again, no longer uncertain. Just understood. That day they worked the field. The soil was wet and dark beneath their boots, the sun strong enough to make sweat bead at their temples. Rosa rolled her sleeves past her elbows and tied her hair back with a scrap of cloth. She moved like someone who belonged there now, who knew which tools needed oil, which rows were due for tilling. Gabe watched her sometimes, not with curiosity, not with hesitation, just like a man looking at something he was learning to let in. Around midday, he limped to the porch and sat. She brought him water without being asked, handed him a rag for his brow, and sat beside him in the shade. He finally broke the quiet. "You planning to stay?" She didn't answer right away. "I don't have another plan," she said. "But that's not the same as staying." He nodded slowly. She turned toward him. "Are you asking?" His jaw worked for a second. Then he met her eyes. "Yeah, I think I am." She looked away for a moment toward the barn, the fence line, the sky above it all. "I haven't belonged anywhere in a long time," she said. "Back east, I was always too much. Too loud, too soft, too big. Then I came here, and suddenly I was too little, too desperate, too inconvenient." Gabe didn't interrupt, just listened. "But here," she hesitated. "You never asked me to be anything." "You didn't need fixing," he said. She turned back to him. "I don't want to be just someone passing through." "You're not." He said it with finality. Not romantic, not poetic, just truth. That night, after supper, Rosa sat near the fire brushing her hair. Gabe watched her from the table, nursing a mug of coffee. The light flickered against her skin. The shirt she wore had slipped slightly, one shoulder bare. He stood slowly, set the mug down, and crossed the floor toward her. She looked up as he approached. He knelt beside her, careful of his leg. "Rosa," he said, quiet. She didn't answer, just waited. He reached out and touched her face. Slowly, his thumb traced her cheek, her jaw. "You don't have to," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I want to." He kissed her gently, and she leaned into it. This time, the kiss lingered. His hand slid to the back of her neck, hers to his chest. Nothing rushed, nothing expected, just breath and closeness and the quiet press of two people who hadn't touched like this in years. Later, lying beside him on the floor in the firelight, she traced the scar on his side without asking. He didn't stop her. She let her fingers rest there. "What are we, Gabe?" she asked. He didn't open his eyes, but he answered, "Real." And in that single word, she found more certainty than any letter or vow she'd been promised before. By early April, the land had softened. Ice no longer clung to the barn roof, and muddy trails ran down from the ridge. Snow had retreated into shadowed gullies, and birdsong returned in short bursts that cut the silence of the valley. Gabe had begun walking straighter again, his limp still there, but less stiff in the warming air. Rosa had started sleeping through the night, and she no longer startled when wind scraped the windows. She was no longer just a guest. She cooked without asking, repaired buttons, cleaned the rifle, planted onion seeds in a line, so neat even Gabe raised an eyebrow. She wore his shirt in the mornings and her patched blue dress in the afternoons, the one she'd resewn from what was left of her travel clothes. It still pulled a little across her chest, but she didn't hide it anymore. Not here. And Gabe, he no longer kept his distance. His hand would rest lightly on her back when passing. His coat, once draped on a hook by the door, now hung beside hers. Their plates shared the same shelf. Their boots sat side by the fire. Nothing had been spoken outright, but everything had changed. Then the knock came. It was late afternoon, sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the porch. Rosa was kneeling in the small garden plot, fingers deep in thawed earth. Gabe was at the shed, oiling a hinge. The knock came heavy, flat, not curious, intentional. Rosa stood slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked toward the door. Gabe was already walking toward her, his face tight. He reached the porch first. It was Emery Baird. The banker's son stood straight in a new coat too fine for trail dust. Boots shined, hair slicked with oil. But his face was red from the ride, and his eyes had the darting edge of a man looking for leverage. "I came to collect what's mine," he said, brushing dirt from his cuff as if the land itself offended him. Gabe stepped forward, one hand resting loosely on the doorframe. "She's not yours," he said. Emery laughed once, short. "I sent for her, paid for her fare. That means something." Rosa stepped onto the porch then, her hair loose around her shoulders, apron still dusted with soil. She didn't speak, just looked at Emery with flat, even eyes. Emery looked her over, and something smug twisted in his mouth. "You filled out even more," he muttered. Guess you've been eating well. Gabe moved. Not a lunge, not a threat, but something shifted in the space between them, and Emery took a half step back. Rosa spoke, voice clear. You paid for a letter and a train ticket. That's all. You don't owe me. You were meant to be my wife, he said indignantly. Instead, you ran off like some saloon girl. I didn't run, Rosa cut in. You turned me away. You humiliated me in front of your father, in front of the whole town. You said I was too much for you. Now you want to claim me because someone else saw worth where you didn't. Emery's face flushed darker. You think staying out here with this cripple makes you something more? Gabe didn't blink. Rosa took one step forward, her chin lifted. I'd rather sleep on dirt beside a man who respects me than sit at a banker's table with someone like you. Silence. Emery's mouth opened, then closed. You're not welcome here, Gabe said. You turn that horse around and you don't come back. Emery's pride fought to stay upright, but there was nothing behind it. Just wind and shame. After a few seconds, he spat into the dirt, turned without another word, and mounted up. They watched him ride off, dust rising behind him as the trail took him back toward town. Rosa stood still for a long moment after he was gone, hands tight at her sides. You all right? Gabe asked. She nodded once. I'm not scared of him. She paused. I hate that I let people like him define my worth for so long. Gabe looked at her, then stepped close. He never saw you. She turned toward him. And you did. He reached out and touched her waist, fingers firm. I saw you the second you sat on that platform and didn't cry. She looked down, a breath catching in her throat. I wanted someone to choose me, she said quietly. Not out of pity, just for me. I did. They stood in silence, the wind soft now, brushing her hair against her face. She reached up, took his hand, and held it there at her waist. That night, when they returned to the cabin, she lit the lamp without speaking. He closed the door behind them. She turned to him and unbuttoned her dress slowly, not in invitation, but in trust. He crossed to her without rushing. When he kissed her, it was quiet and steady. His hands cupped her face like she was something solid. She undressed in front of him for the first time, not ashamed, not small. And he touched her like the shape of her body was something he already knew. Later, tangled in the blanket beside the fire, her head on his chest, his arm around her waist, she whispered, "This feels like home." Gabe didn't say anything, but his hand squeezed hers gently, and he didn't let go. The next morning came clear and quiet, with only the sound of birds returning to the trees and the creek running fast with meltwater. The storm had passed, for good this time. Rosa woke curled against Gabe's side, her cheek resting on his bare chest, his arm wrapped around her like he'd never meant to let go. He was already awake, staring at the ceiling like he had been for a while. But when she stirred, his hand moved gently along her back. She lifted her head. You didn't sleep? I did, he said, but I liked watching you more. She studied his face in the soft light. You're different today. I know, he said. Feels like something settled. She nodded. It had. The following days unfolded like the land itself had softened under their feet. There were no more knocks at the door, no more shadows on the ridge, just work, warmth, and the steady rhythm of something that had grown real. Rosa found herself humming in the garden. She wore her patched blue dress again, mended at the shoulder and taken in slightly at the waist, her apron tied snug. Her curves, once the reason for ridicule, now filled that dress with pride. Her body didn't feel like a burden anymore. She moved like someone who had nothing to hide. Gabe watched her from the porch often, boots resting on the step, a mug in hand. The scowl he used to wear without noticing was mostly gone now. Not replaced by smiles exactly, but something quieter, a kind of peace. One morning, Rosa stood at the fence line, watching the cows graze along the soft hill. Gabe walked up behind her. I'm heading into town tomorrow, he said. She turned. Do you want me to come? No, he said, then added, but I want to bring something back. She raised an eyebrow. What? He hesitated. You'll see. The next afternoon, he returned with two things in his wagon. One was a new kettle. The other was a small box wrapped in cloth, which he handed her like it weighed more than it did. She opened it on the porch, breath catching. Inside was a simple silver ring, nestled in a folded scrap of lace. He didn't get on one knee, didn't make a speech. He just said, "You've been calling this home. I want you to call it yours." Her eyes filled. "It already is." She slid the ring on without hesitation. That evening, they sat by the fire, no words spoken for a long time. Just the quiet sound of kindling snapping and the wind outside brushing gently against the eaves. He rested his hand on her leg as she leaned into his side, head on his shoulder. "Do you want to get married proper?" he asked after a while. "I don't need paper," she said, "but I'd like to hear you say it." "Say what?" "That I'm yours." He looked down at her. "You are. From the first day I saw you on that platform." She smiled. "I wasn't much to look at then." "You were everything," he said. In late May, they planted the last of the potatoes. Gabe dug rows while Rosa dropped seeds. Her belly ached that day in a way that felt unfamiliar. Later that week, she missed her time. She waited a few days before telling him. He didn't panic, didn't even blink. He just pulled her close, pressed a kiss to her temple, and said, "Then we'll make room for more." By the time summer settled across the valley, the cabin no longer looked like a place for one man. A second coat hung beside his. A woman's dress hung near the door. 2 mugs sat ready at the table. And outside, where the porch rail had worn down from years of leaning, 2 sets of arms rested together every evening, watching the last lights sink behind the hills. They never talked much about the past again. Some things didn't need retelling. What mattered was what stayed. And Rosa had stayed, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had chosen this. And Gabe, for all his silence and scars, had chosen her right back. Forever wasn't spoken. It was lived. Every morning, every chore, every look across the table. Here, in their home, where no one questioned her worth ever again.